I discovered my husband Douglas gave his girlfriend the keys to our $2.3 million estate, thinking I was just another housewife. But he forgot I own half the commercial properties in this city. And now his girlfriend Diana is about to lose more than just her sugar daddy. She's about to lose her job, her apartment, and her future because she picked the wrong mogul's husband to mess with. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The security alert pinged on my phone at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Someone had used a key to enter our Beacon Hill mansion while I was supposedly asleep upstairs. The smart lock system I'd installed 6 months ago, the same system Douglas had complained was unnecessarily paranoid, had just captured something that would change everything. I lay perfectly still in our king-sized bed, listening to the soft footsteps downstairs, the gentle closing of cabinets, the whispered voices drifting up through the hardwood floors. Douglas was beside me, breathing deeply in what I now realized was carefully performed sleep. His phone buzzed softly on the nightstand. A text message illuminated the screen. "Coast is clear, baby. See you tomorrow night." D. Not Daryl, his business. Partner, not David, his golf buddy. D for Diana. Diana Carmichael, the 28-year-old marketing coordinator at Pinnacle Properties, the same Diana who worked in the building I owned, in the office space I leased to her company, paying rent that ultimately ended up in my accounts. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. Almost. I'd built my real estate empire from nothing, starting with a single duplex I'd bought at 23 with money saved from working 3 jobs. While other women my age were focused on finding husbands, I was focused on finding undervalued properties. By 30, I owned 12 rental units. By 35, I'd expanded into commercial real estate. Now, at 42, my portfolio included over 60 properties across the city, office buildings, apartment complexes, retail spaces, and prime development land worth over $50 million. Douglas knew this, of course. He'd married Margaret Wellington, the real estate mogul, not just some wealthy woman. He'd enjoyed the lifestyle my success provided: the mansion in Beacon Hill, the summer house on Martha's Vineyard, the European vacations, the country club memberships. He'd even convinced me to put his name on several properties for tax purposes, a decision I was now reconsidering with crystal clarity. But somewhere along the way, Douglas had apparently forgotten who he was dealing with. He'd forgotten that the woman who'd negotiated million-dollar deals and outmaneuvered seasoned developers wasn't someone who could be easily deceived. He'd forgotten that I didn't just own properties. I owned information, connections, and leverage. Throughout this city, the footsteps moved toward the kitchen. I heard the refrigerator door open, the soft clink of glass. She was making herself comfortable in my home, probably drinking the expensive wine I'd selected from our cellar. The thought sent a cold fury through my veins, but I remained motionless, calculating. This wasn't just about an affair. This was about violation of the most fundamental kind. Douglas hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He'd brought another woman into our sanctuary, the home I'd designed and paid for, giving her access to our private space as if it belonged to him to give. I thought about Diana Carmichael, with her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I'd seen her around the city, at networking events and business functions. She was ambitious. I'd give her that. She'd climbed from an entry-level position to marketing coordinator in just 2 years. But she'd made a critical error in judgment. She'd chosen to tangle with someone who controlled far more than she realized. My phone buzzed again. Another security alert. She was in my home office now, the space where I conducted million-dollar transactions and planned development projects that would reshape the city's skyline. The thought of her touching my things, possibly even accessing confidential business information, made my blood boil. But as the initial shock and anger settled, something else took its place. The calculating calm that had served me well in countless negotiations. This wasn't just a betrayal to be emotional about. This was a problem to be solved strategically. And I had resources Diana Carmichael couldn't even imagine. I knew where she lived, apartment 4B in the Riverside Towers, a building I'd been considering purchasing for months. The owner had been struggling with mortgage payments and had approached me about a possible sale. One phone call could change Diana's living situation dramatically. I knew where she worked. Pinnacle Properties occupied the entire third floor of the Wellington building on State Street. My building. Her company's lease was up for renewal in 4 months, and their rent had been deliberately kept below market rate because I'd had a good relationship with their CEO, Travis Morrison. That relationship could evolve quickly if circumstances changed. I knew her social circle. Most of the young professionals she networked with lived in properties I owned or worked in buildings where I had influence. Her carefully cultivated lifestyle depended on connections and opportunities that flowed through my city, my empire. Douglas shifted beside me, his breathing changing slightly. Was he awake? Monitoring the situation? Did he know I was aware of what was happening downstairs? The questions multiplied, but the answers would come with time and careful observation. The security system chimed softly as the front door closed. She was leaving, probably thinking she'd gotten away with her clandestine visit. Douglas's breathing returned to the deep, regular pattern of sleep, or performed sleep. I lay in the darkness for another hour, my mind working through possibilities and strategies. Douglas had made a fundamental miscalculation. He'd confused my success with softness, my trust with naivety. He'd brought his affair into my home, given my keys to his girlfriend, and violated the sanctuary I'd built with my own hands and mind. But he'd forgotten something crucial. I wasn't just wealthy. I was powerful. I didn't just have money. I had influence, connections, and the ability to reshape lives with a few strategic decisions. Diana Carmichael was about to learn that sleeping with a real estate mogul's husband came with consequences she'd never considered. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter, not just in my marriage, but in demonstrating exactly why crossing Margaret Wellington was the worst business decision anyone could make. Douglas thought he was playing a game he could win through deception and betrayal. He was about to discover he'd challenged the wrong woman to the wrong fight, and I never lost. The next morning, Douglas performed his usual routine with Oscar-worthy precision. He kissed my cheek while I sipped coffee at the marble kitchen island, his lips lingering just long enough to seem genuine. "Big day ahead," he said, adjusting his tie, the burgundy silk one I'd bought him for our anniversary 2 years ago. The Henderson project meeting ran late last night, but I think we're finally making progress. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral while my mind cataloged the lie. The Henderson project had been completed 6 months ago. I knew because Henderson Development had paid their final invoice to Douglas's architectural firm in March, a payment that had gone through the Wellington Buildings Management Company, my company. "That's wonderful, honey," I replied, my voice carrying the same warmth it had for 17 years of marriage. "I'll probably work from home today. I have some property evaluations to review." Douglas's face flickered, just for a microsecond, with something that might have been concern or calculation. Did he wonder what properties I was evaluating? Did he worry that I might uncover something he'd prefer remained hidden? "Sounds good," he said, grabbing his keys from the ceramic bowl by the door. The same bowl where I'd watched him place an extra set of keys 3 weeks ago, keys I'd assumed were for his office. Now I knew better. After his BMW disappeared down Beacon Street, I sat in my home office, surrounded by the mahogany bookshelves filled with real estate law volumes and industry publications. This room had witnessed countless negotiations, where I'd acquired properties and orchestrated deals that had built my empire. Today, it would witness the beginning of a different kind of acquisition, the systematic gathering of information that would determine the fate of my marriage and my husband's future. I opened my laptop and accessed the building management software that tracked all my properties. Riverside Towers appeared on the screen, its 42 units generating steady monthly income. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Apartment 4B. Diana Carmichael, lease signed 18 months ago, rent paid consistently on the first of each month through automatic bank transfer. Her lease application was still in the system. I'd approved it personally, though I hadn't paid much attention at the time. Diana had listed her employment at Pinnacle Properties, with a salary that seemed adequate for the rent she was paying. Her references had checked out, her credit score was respectable, and she'd provided a security deposit without issue. But now, looking at her file with new eyes, details jumped out that I'd missed before. Her emergency contact wasn't a family member or friend. It was Douglas Wellington, listed as family friend. My husband had been connected to this woman for at least 18 months, possibly longer. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a recent affair born of midlife crisis or opportunity. This was a calculated, long-term relationship that had been hidden in plain sight. Douglas had used his connection to me to help establish Diana in her apartment, probably recommending the building to her, maybe even influencing my decision to approve her application. I pulled Diana's employment records from Pinnacle Properties' lease file. She'd started at the company 26 months ago, just after graduating from Boston University with a marketing degree. Her salary had increased twice in the past year, unusual for someone so early in their career. Either she was exceptionally talented, or she was receiving help from someone with influence. Travis Morrison, Pinnacle's CEO, had been my tenant for 4 years. He'd always been professional in our dealings, never mentioning any personal connections to my husband. But Douglas moved in architectural circles, attending industry events and networking functions. It wouldn't be difficult for him to arrange introductions or make recommendations. I called my assistant, Elsie Patterson, who'd been managing my property portfolio for 8 years. If anyone could help me understand the connections between Douglas, Diana, and Pinnacle Properties, it would be Elsie. "Margaret," she answered on the first ring, her voice carrying the efficiency that made her invaluable. "What can I do for you? I need you to pull together everything we have on Pinnacle Properties and their employees," I said, keeping my tone businesslike. "Lease agreements, payment history, any correspondence with management. Also, I want a complete financial analysis of their company, revenue, growth patterns, anything publicly available." "Of course," Elsie replied, though I caught a note of curiosity in her voice. "Is there a particular reason? Are we considering changes to their lease terms?" "Just due diligence," I said. "I'm reviewing all our commercial tenants for potential lease renewals." It wasn't entirely a lie. I was reviewing Pinnacle Properties, just not for the reasons Elsie assumed. After hanging up, I accessed the security footage from the Wellington building. As the owner, I had access to all common areas, including the lobby and parking garage. I scrolled through the past month's footage, looking for patterns, for evidence of Douglas visiting the building outside of normal business hours. There, 2 weeks ago, on a Thursday evening at 7:23 p.m., Douglas entering through the main lobby, but instead of heading to the elevator banks that served the floors where he occasionally met with clients, he walked toward the side entrance that led to the parking garage. Internal cameras showed him taking the garage elevator directly to the 3rd floor. He stayed for 47 minutes. The timestamp showed he left at 8:10 p.m., the same night he'd texted me saying he was grabbing drinks with his business partner, Daryl, and would be home late. I'd been at a city planning meeting until 9 p.m. that night, discussing zoning changes for a property development project. I checked more dates, looking for patterns. The previous month revealed 3 similar visits, all during times when I had been occupied with business commitments Douglas knew about in advance. He'd been using my schedule against me. timing his visits to Diana's workplace when he knew I'd be unavailable. But there was something else in the footage that made my blood run cold. In the most recent video, Diana wasn't alone when Douglas left the building. She walked with him to the parking garage, and they stood beside his car for several minutes in conversation. At 8:05 p.m., she handed him something small, something that glinted in the harsh garage lighting: keys. She'd given him keys to something, not just our house keys, but keys she had access to. Keys to the Wellington building, perhaps, or to Pinnacle Properties' office space. Douglas hadn't just been carrying on an affair. He'd been given access to my commercial property by his girlfriend, access he had no business having. The scope of the betrayal was expanding beyond personal infidelity. This was about trust, about boundaries, about the fundamental violation of mixing my business assets with his personal indiscretions. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the frozen image on my screen. Douglas's face was clearly visible in the security footage, his expression relaxed and confident as he took the keys from Diana's hand. He looked like a man who believed he was in complete control of the situation. He had no idea that every move he'd made in my building had been recorded, that every lie he'd told could be cross-referenced with digital evidence, that the woman he'd married wasn't just wealthy. She was methodical. The investigation was just beginning, but already the picture was becoming clear. Douglas had underestimated not just my capabilities, but my reach. He'd brought his affair into my world, used my properties as meeting places, and compromised my business security for his personal pleasure. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was assuming I wouldn't notice. He was about to discover there wouldn't be a third. By 2 p.m., Elsie had delivered everything I'd requested about Pinnacle Properties, and the information painted a picture that made my suspicions crystallize into certainty. The financial records showed a company that had grown remarkably quickly for a mid-sized marketing firm, landing several high-profile clients in the past 18 months, clients that happened to be developers and construction companies Douglas worked with regularly. I spread the documents across my mahogany desk like pieces of a puzzle. Pinnacle's client roster read like a who's who of Douglas's professional network. Morrison Development, Blackstone Construction, Harbor Point Ventures. Companies that Douglas had architectural contracts with were suddenly hiring Diana's marketing firm for their promotional campaigns. This wasn't coincidence. This was orchestration. My phone rang, interrupting my analysis. The caller ID showed Travis Morrison's name, as if the universe was delivering him to me at the exact moment I needed answers. Margaret. Travis's voice carried its usual professional warmth. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I wanted to discuss renewing our lease for Pinnacle Properties. We're hoping to expand into the fourth floor space if it becomes available. Perfect. Of course, Travis. Actually, I've been reviewing your account today. Your company has experienced impressive growth recently. Yes, we've been fortunate, he replied, and I could hear the pride in his voice. Our marketing coordinator, Diana, has been instrumental in landing some major clients. She has excellent connections in the architectural and development community. My grip tightened on the phone. Really? That's quite impressive for someone so early in their career. Well, she came highly recommended, Travis continued, apparently unaware he was handing me exactly the information I needed. Your husband. Douglas vouched for her personally when she applied for the position, said she was brilliant and had great potential in the industry. The pieces clicked together with devastating clarity. Douglas hadn't just been having an affair with Diana, he'd been actively building her career, using his professional connections to secure her employment and advance her position. In return, she'd been steering business to companies that hired Douglas's architectural firm, creating a mutually beneficial arrangement that had been generating income for both of them. I see, I managed, keeping my voice neutral. Douglas has always been generous with his professional recommendations. Absolutely, Travis agreed. In fact, he's the one who suggested we lease space in your building. Said it would be perfect for our needs and that you were an excellent landlord to work with. Another puzzle piece. Douglas had orchestrated Diana's employment and her company's location in my building. He'd created a situation where his girlfriend worked in a space I owned, paid rent that went into my accounts, while conducting business that ultimately benefited his own firm. The audacity was breathtaking. After ending the call with Travis, I immediately called my lawyer, Scott Harrison. No relation to my husband, despite the shared first name. Scott had handled all my major property acquisitions and understood the intricacies of commercial real estate better than anyone. Margaret, Scott's voice was crisp and professional when he answered. What can I do for you? I need you to review some contracts for me, I said, choosing my words carefully. Specifically, I want to understand the legal implications if a tenant is using my property for purposes that weren't disclosed in the lease agreement. That's interesting, Scott replied, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Are we talking about a residential or commercial tenant? Commercial. And Scott, I need this handled with complete discretion. No documentation in your regular files, no discussions with associates. This is highly sensitive. There was a pause. Scott had worked with me long enough to understand that when I requested discretion, there were usually significant implications involved. Of course, he said. Can you give me more specifics about the nature of the undisclosed activities? I explained the situation carefully, focusing on the business relationships and potential conflicts of interest, without mentioning the personal aspects. Scott listened without interruption, asking clarifying questions that demonstrated he was already thinking about legal strategies. This is potentially serious, he concluded. If they're using your property to conduct business relationships that weren't disclosed, and especially if those relationships involve kickbacks or undisclosed financial arrangements, you could have grounds for lease termination and possibly civil action. What kind of evidence would I need? Financial records showing the business relationships, communications demonstrating the coordination of contracts, anything that proves the tenant's use of your property was materially different from what was represented in the lease. I already had some of that evidence, and I knew where to find more. After hanging up with Scott, I turned my attention to the financial connections between Douglas's firm and Pinnacle's clients. My industry connections provided access to public records that most people never bothered to examine. Building permits, contract awards, zoning applications. All public information that told the story of money flowing between companies. What I discovered made my earlier suspicions look conservative. Over the past 18 months, companies that hired Pinnacle Properties for marketing services had awarded Douglas's architectural firm over $3.2 million in contracts. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Within weeks of Pinnacle signing a marketing contract with a developer, that same developer would announce an architectural contract with Douglas Wellington Design. Diana wasn't just Douglas's girlfriend. She was his business partner in a sophisticated scheme that was generating substantial income for both of them. She would secure marketing contracts with developers, then influence those same developers to hire Douglas for their architectural needs. In return, Douglas provided her with industry connections and recommendations that advanced her career. But they'd made a critical error. They'd built their scheme using my property as the foundation. Diana worked in my building, used my conference rooms for client meetings, and conducted business that was generating revenue through relationships my husband had facilitated. Every meeting Diana held in the Wellington building was documented by security cameras. Every email sent through Pinnacle's servers was backed up on systems I had access to as the building owner. Every client who visited Diana's office was recorded entering and leaving my property. I spent the rest of the afternoon methodically documenting the connections, names, dates, contract amounts, meeting schedules. The pattern was so clear that even someone without business experience could see it immediately. Douglas and Diana had built their partnership on the assumption that I would never look closely enough to notice the relationships they'd created. They'd underestimated the thoroughness that had made me successful in real estate. the attention to detail that had built my empire. But more than that, they'd made the fundamental error of conducting their business using my assets. Every document, every meeting, every transaction they'd conducted in my building belonged to me. Their scheme had been built on my property, using my resources, generating revenue that was partially dependent on my infrastructure. They'd just handed me everything I needed to destroy them both. As evening approached, I closed my laptop and locked the documents in my office safe. Tomorrow, I would begin phase 2 of my investigation. Tonight, I would sit across from Douglas at dinner and watch him lie to my face, knowing that every word he spoke was another piece of evidence I could use against him. The hunter had become the hunted, and Douglas had no idea the trap was already closing around them both. That evening, Douglas arrived home at 6:30 p.m. with a bouquet of white roses, my favorite flowers, though he'd only remembered this detail in the past few months. The timing of his newfound attentiveness now felt calculated rather than romantic. "For my beautiful wife," he said, kissing my forehead as he handed me the flowers. "I thought we could have a quiet dinner together. Maybe open that bottle of Bordeaux we've been saving." I accepted the roses with a smile that felt like wearing a mask. "How thoughtful. Let me put these in water while you get changed." As Douglas headed upstairs, I arranged the flowers in a crystal vase, wondering if Diana had helped him pick them out, if they'd discussed what would make his wife happy while planning their next rendezvous. The thought made my hands tremble, slightly as I trimmed the stems. Dinner was a masterclass in deception from both sides. Douglas spoke enthusiastically about his current projects, weaving elaborate stories about client meetings and design challenges. I nodded appropriately, asking the right questions, all while cataloging every lie against the evidence I'd gathered. "The Morrison project is really taking off," Douglas said, cutting into his steak. "They're talking about expanding the scope significantly." Morrison Development, one of Pinnacle Properties' biggest clients, and now I understood why. Diana had secured their marketing contract 6 months ago, just before they'd awarded Douglas a $400,000 architectural project. "That's wonderful," I replied, sipping my wine. "Will this mean more travel for you?" "Probably some," Douglas said, not meeting my eyes. "These big projects require a lot of coordination with the marketing team. Diana, she's their coordinator. She's been incredibly helpful in bridging the communication between our firms." The casual mention of Diana's name sent ice through my veins, but I kept my expression neutral. "She sounds very competent." "Oh, she is." Douglas's voice carried a warmth that made my stomach clench. "Brilliant, actually. She has this natural understanding of how to position architectural projects to investors and the public. It's rare to find someone so young with such sophisticated marketing instincts." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity. Douglas was sitting at our dinner table, praising his girlfriend's professional abilities to his wife, completely unaware that I knew every detail of their relationship. The arrogance was staggering. "Perhaps I should meet her sometime," I suggested, watching his reaction carefully. "If she's working so closely with your firm, it might be beneficial for me to understand her approach. I do have several development projects that could use marketing support." For just a moment, Douglas looked genuinely panicked. His fork paused halfway to his mouth, and I saw him calculating the risks of his wife and girlfriend meeting. That's an interesting idea," he managed, "though I think she's pretty overwhelmed with her current client load. Maybe once things settle down." "Of course," I agreed easily. "No rush." After dinner, Douglas excused himself to make some phone calls, retreating to his study with his cell phone. I cleaned up the kitchen, my mind working through the implications of everything I'd learned today. The business relationship between Douglas and Diana was more sophisticated than a simple kickback scheme. It was a full partnership that had been generating millions in revenue. But there was still something missing. The key exchange I'd witnessed on the security footage suggested a level of access that went beyond just business meetings. Diana had given Douglas keys, and I needed to understand what those keys opened. At 11 p.m., after Douglas had gone to bed, I accessed the Wellington Building's security system from my laptop. The after-hours access log showed several entries using Diana's keycard outside normal business hours, entries that corresponded with dates when Douglas had claimed to be working late or meeting with clients. But more interesting were the entries to floors that Pinnacle Properties didn't lease. Diana's keycard had been used to access the building's executive conference room on the 10th floor, a premium space I rented to high-end clients for important meetings, on 3 separate occasions in the past month. I pulled the booking records for the executive conference room. None of those 3 dates showed legitimate reservations. Someone had been using my most expensive meeting space without authorization, without payment, for purposes I hadn't approved. The security footage from the 10th floor told the complete story. Douglas and Diana had been using my executive conference room for private meetings with clients, meetings that resulted in contracts for both of their firms. They'd been presenting themselves as a unified team, using my luxury space to impress potential clients and close deals. In one video, dated just 2 weeks ago, I watched Douglas and Diana meet with representatives from Harbor Point Ventures, a development company I'd been trying to attract as a tenant for months. The meeting lasted 3 hours, and I could see documents spread across the mahogany conference table, presentations being given on the large screen I'd installed for client use. Within days of that meeting, Harbor Point Ventures had awarded Pinnacle Properties a $200,000 marketing contract and Douglas's firm a $800,000 architectural project. They'd been running a full-scale business operation from my property, using my facilities to generate revenue, all while I remained completely unaware. The audacity was breathtaking, but so was the opportunity it presented. Every meeting they'd held in my building was documented. Every presentation, every handshake, every signed contract, all captured by security cameras in crystal clear detail. They'd created a complete video record of their business partnership, their coordination of contracts, and their use of my property for unauthorized purposes. But as I reviewed more footage, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. In the most recent video from the executive conference room, Diana and Douglas weren't just meeting with clients. After the Harbor Point representatives left, they remained in the room alone. What I witnessed next wasn't business. It was intimate, passionate, and completely inappropriate for a professional setting. They'd been using my conference room not just for business meetings, but for personal encounters. My most prestigious business space had been violated in ways that went far beyond unauthorized use. I closed the laptop, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and disgust. Douglas hadn't just betrayed our marriage and stolen from my business. He'd desecrated my professional reputation by conducting an affair in the space where I entertained my most important clients. But their violation had also provided me with something invaluable, irrefutable evidence of their relationship, their business partnership, and their complete disregard for the boundaries of marriage, business ethics, and professional conduct. Tomorrow, I would begin documenting everything. By the time I was finished, Douglas and Diana would understand exactly what it meant to betray someone who controlled not just their business opportunities, but the very buildings where they'd built their scheme. They'd handed me the keys to their destruction, and I intended to use them. The next morning, I called in sick to my own company for the first time in 3 years. Douglas expressed appropriate concern, bringing me tea and promising to check on me throughout the day. His performance was flawless. The caring husband worried about his wife's sudden illness. "Are you sure you don't want me to stay home with you?" he asked, straightening his tie in our bedroom mirror. "Don't be silly," I replied, pulling the covers up to my chin. "It's probably just a 24-hour bug. You have that important client presentation today." Douglas's reflection paused. There was no client presentation scheduled. I'd checked his calendar through our shared business contacts. But I wanted to see where he'd go when he thought I was, safely confined to bed. Right. The presentation, he said quickly. Morrison Development. Big day. After his car disappeared down the street, I was up and dressed within minutes. Today would be about systematic documentation, building an evidence file that would be impossible to dispute or explain away. I started with financial records, pulling bank statements for both our personal and business accounts. Douglas had been careful, but not careful enough. Small cash withdrawals that I'd previously attributed to normal expenses now formed a pattern. Restaurant charges at upscale establishments on days when he'd claimed to be eating lunch at his desk. Hotel charges in the city on nights when he'd said he was working late at the office. But it wasn't just the obvious expenses. There were charges to florists, jewelry stores, and boutique clothing shops. Purchases that had never resulted in gifts for me. The financial trail painted a picture of a man maintaining a second life, funding romantic gestures and expensive tastes for someone who wasn't his wife. I photographed every suspicious transaction, creating a digital folder organized by date and category. The pattern was clear. Douglas had been spending our money to court Diana while lying to me about working late. Next, I turned to the security footage from the Wellington building. Over the past month, I identified 14 instances where Diana and Douglas had met privately in my building after normal business hours. But reviewing the footage more carefully revealed something I'd missed initially. They weren't always alone. In several videos, a third person was present, a tall man in expensive suits who carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to power. I didn't recognize him immediately, but his body language during the meetings suggested he was either a client or someone with significant influence over business decisions. I screenshot his face from multiple angles and ran them through a reverse image search. Within minutes, I had his identity. Daryl Hammond, CEO of Metropolitan Development Group, one of the largest real estate development companies on the East Coast. My heart raced as the implications became clear. Daryl Hammond wasn't just a random client. He was a major player in the development world, someone with the power to award contracts worth tens of millions. And he'd been meeting privately with Douglas and Diana in my building, in meetings that weren't recorded in any official business records. I pulled Metropolitan Development's recent project announcements and cross-referenced them with the dates of their private meetings in my building. The correlation was perfect. Within weeks of each clandestine meeting, Metropolitan would announce new projects requiring both architectural services and marketing support. But Daryl Hammond presented a complication I hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just participating in Douglas and Diana's scheme, he appeared to be directing it. In the security footage, he was clearly the one leading conversations, pointing to documents, making decisions that Douglas and Diana responded to immediately. This wasn't just about my husband's affair or even their business partnership. They'd been facilitating meetings with major developers, using my property as a neutral location where sensitive business discussions could take place without official oversight. The scope of what they'd been doing was staggering. My building hadn't just been used for their personal relationship. It had become an unofficial headquarters for deal-making that bypassed normal business channels. I spent the afternoon creating a comprehensive timeline that connected the private meetings in my building with subsequent contract announcements, business deals, and financial transfers. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. But as I worked, I realized I needed more than just evidence of what had happened. I needed to understand what was still happening. Douglas and Diana's operation was ongoing, which meant I could gather real-time evidence of their activities. I called Elsie and asked her to install additional security cameras in the Wellington building's common areas, particularly near the executive conference room and parking garage. I want complete coverage of all after-hours activity, I explained. This is a security upgrade that's long overdue. I also requested access logs for all key card entries over the past 6 months, not just the past month I'd already reviewed. If Douglas and Diana had been operating for 18 months, there would be a much longer paper trail of unauthorized building access. By evening, I had assembled a file that told a complete story of deception, unauthorized property use, and business ethics violations. But more importantly, I had a plan for gathering the additional evidence I would need to ensure that when I acted, the consequences would be swift and comprehensive. Douglas returned home that evening with another bouquet of flowers and stories about his successful presentation to Morrison Development. I accepted both with the same practiced smile, knowing that tomorrow I would begin the next phase of my investigation. They thought they were running a sophisticated operation. They had no idea they'd been documenting their own destruction. The new security cameras Elsie had installed were already paying dividends. Within 48 hours, they'd captured something that changed everything I thought I knew about Douglas and Diana's operation. At 7:30 p.m. on Thursday, while Douglas was supposedly at a dinner meeting with potential clients, the cameras showed him entering the Wellington building with Diana and two other people I didn't initially recognize. But when I enhanced the footage and cross-referenced the faces, my blood turned to ice. One was Simone Crawford, the city's deputy planning commissioner, the woman who controlled zoning approvals and development permits for every major construction project in the metropolitan area. The other was a man I'd seen at city council meetings, Marcus Webb, head of the Municipal Development Authority. They weren't just running a business scheme. They were operating at the level of city government, involving officials who controlled the regulatory approval process that every real estate development depended on. I watched the four of them disappear into the executive conference room, where they remained for over 3 hours. When they emerged, Simone Crawford was carrying a briefcase she hadn't brought in, and Marcus Webb was reviewing documents on his phone with the focused attention of someone confirming important details. The implications were staggering. Douglas and Diana weren't just coordinating business deals. They were facilitating meetings between developers and city officials, creating opportunities for the kind of influence that could fast-track permit approvals and zoning changes worth millions. I immediately began researching the recent projects that Metropolitan Development and other companies in their network had received approval for. What I found was a pattern of unusually quick permit approvals, zoning variances that had been granted without the typical community input periods, and environmental reviews that had been expedited through processes that normally took months. Douglas's architectural firm had been hired for every single one of these fast-tracked projects. But as I dug deeper into the city records, I discovered something that made my hands shake as I typed. 3 of the properties that had received expedited development approvals were parcels I had been quietly acquiring through shell companies over the past 2 years, properties I'd intended to develop myself once I'd assembled enough contiguous land. Douglas knew about my development plans. We'd discussed them over dinner, during weekend conversations about future projects. He'd listened to my vision for creating a mixed-use development that would revitalize the old warehouse district, nodding supportively as I explained my timeline and strategy. And then he'd stolen it. Using information I'd shared with him in confidence, Douglas had approached other developers and offered them the opportunity to outbid me for the remaining properties I needed. Worse, he'd facilitated their meetings with city officials who could expedite the approval process, making their competing developments more attractive than mine. The property records told the complete story. While I'd been methodically acquiring parcels at fair market prices, respecting zoning requirements and following proper procedures, Douglas had been orchestrating a shadow campaign that undermined my project at every turn. 3 weeks ago, Harbor Point Ventures had acquired the final 2 properties I needed for my development, properties they'd bought at prices far above market value, confident they could recoup the costs through expedited development approvals that I'd never been offered. Douglas hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He'd sabotaged my business, stolen years of planning and preparation, and handed my vision to competitors who were now profiting from work I'd done. I called Scott Harrison immediately, not caring that it was nearly 10 p.m. "Margaret?" Scott's voice was alert despite the late hour. "What's wrong?" I need you to pull every public record related to development permits issued in the past 18 months, I said, my voice tight with controlled anger. Specifically, I want to know about any expedited approvals, zoning variances, or environmental reviews that were fast-tracked. That's a lot of records, Scott replied. Are we talking about a specific area of the city? The warehouse district. And Scott, I need this done quietly. Use a third-party research service if necessary, but I don't want any record of Wellington Properties requesting this information. There was a pause. Margaret, what exactly are we dealing with here? Corruption, I said simply, possibly at the municipal level. And I think my husband is in the middle of it. Scott's intake of breath was audible. Jesus. Okay, I'll get started on this tomorrow. But Margaret, if we're talking about municipal corruption, you need to be extremely careful about how you proceed. These kinds of situations can become dangerous very quickly. I understood his concern, but I was beyond being careful. Douglas had stolen more than just my trust. He'd stolen my future, my business plans, and years of work. He'd used my own confidences against me, turning our pillow talk into intelligence that he'd sold to my competitors. The next morning, I received an email from Scott with preliminary findings that confirmed my worst fears. The warehouse district. Development approvals had been expedited through a process that bypassed normal environmental review requirements, community input sessions, and competitive bidding procedures. The companies that had benefited from these expedited approvals had collectively saved an estimated $15 million in regulatory compliance costs and 18 months of development time. But the most damaging revelation was in the communication records that Scott had obtained through public information requests. Email exchanges between city officials showed explicit coordination with architectural consultants who were providing development feasibility analysis for projects before they were officially submitted for approval. Douglas had been advising city officials on which projects to fast-track based on inside information about financing, market conditions, and competitive developments. He'd essentially been serving as an unofficial development advisor to the city, using knowledge gained from his relationship with me and other developers to help officials make decisions that benefited his criminal network. After hanging up with Scott, I sat in my office surrounded by evidence of a betrayal that went far deeper than infidelity. Douglas had systematically undermined everything I'd worked to build, using his access to my plans and his relationship with Diana to create opportunities for people who were directly competing against me. But in their arrogance, they'd documented everything. Every meeting in my building was recorded, every conversation captured, every handshake and document exchange preserved in high-definition video. They'd built their empire of corruption using my property as headquarters, and in doing so, they'd handed me every piece of evidence I needed to destroy not just their scheme, but everyone involved in it. The city officials taking bribes, the developers cutting corners, the woman who'd stolen my husband. They'd all made the same mistake. They'd underestimated Margaret Wellington. Friday morning brought a phone call that would change everything. Scott's voice was tense when I answered, carrying the weight of information that couldn't be discussed over regular phone lines. Margaret, we need to meet in person, he said, without preamble. What I've found? It's bigger than we thought. Much bigger. An hour later, I sat across from Scott in a private dining room at the Harbor Club, a location he'd chosen specifically because it was sweep-proof and frequented by people who understood the value of discretion. Before I show you this, Scott began, sliding a manila envelope across the table, I need you to understand that what we're dealing with isn't just municipal corruption. It's organized, systematic, and it goes all the way to the state level. Opened the envelope, and the documents inside made my vision blur with rage. Development contracts worth over $200 million, all awarded to a network of companies connected to Douglas, Diana, and their growing circle of co-conspirators. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the letterhead on several key documents. Wellington Development Consortium. Douglas had created a company using my name, trading on my reputation in the real estate community to legitimize deals that I'd never approved, never seen, and never benefited from. He'd been impersonating my business identity to facilitate corruption on a massive scale. "How is this possible?" I whispered, staring at contracts bearing a forged version of my signature. "Your husband is more connected than either of us realized," Scott replied grimly. The Wellington Development Consortium was incorporated 60 months ago, with Douglas listed as CEO and managing partner. The paperwork shows you as a silent partner, though obviously your actual signature appears nowhere in the legitimate filing documents. I flipped through page after page of fraudulent contracts, each one representing projects worth millions, all bearing my company's name without my knowledge or consent. Douglas hadn't just stolen my development plans, he'd stolen my identity, my reputation, and my legal standing in the business community. "There's more," Scott continued, pulling out a second folder. "The State Attorney General's office has been investigating irregularities in municipal development approvals for the past 8 months. They don't know about your husband's involvement yet, but they're getting close. The implications hit me like a physical blow. When the state investigation reached Douglas, they would find a paper trail leading directly to Wellington Development Consortium. To my name, my reputation, my business empire. I would be implicated in corruption charges for crimes I'd never committed, deals I'd never made, and bribes I'd never authorized. Douglas hadn't just betrayed me, he'd set me up to take the fall for his criminal enterprise. "How long do we have?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Weeks, maybe less," Scott replied. "The AG's office is following the money trail, and all roads lead to the development contracts your husband has been facilitating. When they subpoena the financial records for Wellington Development Consortium, they're going to find your name all over everything." I sat back in my chair, the full scope of Douglas's betrayal finally becoming clear. This wasn't just about an affair or business. Corruption. It was about destroying me completely. By using my name and reputation to legitimize his criminal activities, Douglas had created a situation where I would be the primary target when law enforcement inevitably closed in. But as the initial shock wore off, something else took its place. The cold, calculating fury that had built my real estate empire. Douglas thought he'd been clever, setting me up as the fall guy for his crimes. He'd underestimated the resources I had at my disposal and the connections I'd built over 2 decades in business. "Scott," I said quietly, "I need you to contact the State Attorney General's office immediately." His eyebrows shot up. "Margaret, that's extremely risky. If you're connected to this investigation—" "I'm not connected to it," I interrupted. "I'm the victim of it. Douglas has been using my identity to commit fraud, and I have evidence that proves I've been systematically excluded from every aspect of Wellington Development Consortium's operations." I pulled out my phone and showed Scott the security footage from my building, the documented meetings I'd never been invited to, the contracts signed in my name while I was provably elsewhere. "We're not going to wait for them to come to us," I continued. "We're going to give them everything they need to understand that Douglas Wellington and his associates have been committing fraud using my stolen identity." Scott stared at me for a long moment, then slowly began to smile. "You want to flip the script?" "Exactly. Instead of being the target of their investigation, I'm going to be their star witness. I have documentation of every meeting, every illegal transaction, every forged signature. I have video evidence of city officials taking bribes. In my building, financial records showing money laundering through fake companies, and proof that my husband has been systematically defrauding both me and the state." But there was another layer to my strategy that I didn't share with Scott immediately. The security footage from my building didn't just document Douglas's crimes, it provided evidence of every person who had participated in the corruption network. City officials, developers, and business executives had all been captured on camera, participating in illegal activities. I had the power to expose the entire network, but I also had the power to control how that exposure unfolded. Some of the people caught on my cameras were simply following Douglas's lead, unaware of the broader criminal enterprise they'd become part of. Others, like Simone Crawford and Marcus Webb, were clearly willing participants who had been corrupting the development approval process for personal gain. My evidence could differentiate between the unwitting participants and the criminal masterminds, potentially offering cooperation opportunities to those who had been misled while ensuring maximum consequences for those who had knowingly violated the public trust. I stood up, straightening my jacket with the same gesture I'd used before closing million-dollar deals. Douglas thought he could destroy me by dragging me down with him, I said. Instead, he's given me everything I need to destroy him completely. The game had changed, and now I held all the cards. But more than that, I held the power to reshape how justice was delivered to everyone involved in the network Douglas had thought he was clever enough to control. He was about to learn that Margaret Wellington didn't just win. She decided who else got to win, and who would lose everything that weekend. While Douglas attended what he claimed was a golf tournament in Providence, I transformed my home office into a war room. The mahogany conference table that had witnessed countless property acquisitions now served as command central for the systematic dismantling of my husband's criminal enterprise. Elsie arrived Saturday morning with 3 large boxes of documents. Her usual efficiency tinged with concern as she surveyed the scope of materials spread across my office. "Margaret," she said carefully, "I've been with you for 8 years and I've never seen you this focused. What exactly are we dealing with?" I looked up from the timeline I'd been constructing, seeing my assistant's worried expression. Elsie had been more than an employee. She'd been a trusted confidant who'd helped build my empire. She deserved to know the truth. "My husband has been running a criminal organization using my name and properties," I said simply. "He's committed fraud, bribery, and identity theft on a scale that could destroy everything I've built. And he's done it all while sleeping in my bed and kissing me goodbye every morning." Elsie's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, and finally the same cold determination I'd seen in my own mirror. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next 6 hours, we constructed a comprehensive battle plan. Using Elsie's organizational skills and my strategic thinking, we created a systematic approach that would expose Douglas's crimes while protecting my business empire and personal assets. First, we established a secure communication protocol. All sensitive documents would be stored on encrypted drives kept in my personal safe. Communications with Scott and other legal counsel would be conducted through secured phones and encrypted email accounts. We couldn't risk Douglas discovering our investigation before we were ready to act. Second, we created a detailed timeline that connected every piece of evidence we'd gathered. The security footage from my building, the financial records showing unauthorized use of my identity, the property records documenting stolen development plans, everything was organized chronologically to tell a clear story of systematic fraud. But the most crucial element of our plan was timing. The State Attorney General's investigation was progressing independently, and we needed to position ourselves as victims and witnesses before we could be implicated as participants. "Scott scheduled our meeting with the AG's office for Wednesday," I told Elsie as we reviewed our evidence files. "By then, we need to have a complete package that proves my innocence while documenting Douglas's guilt beyond any doubt." Elsie nodded, making notes on her tablet. "What about Diana and the others? Simone Crawford, Marcus Webb, Daryl Hammond, they're all involved in this." "They're Douglas's problem now," I replied. "When the state investigation reaches them, they'll have to decide whether to cooperate with prosecutors or go down with the ship. Either way, their careers and reputations will be destroyed." But there was one aspect of the plan that required delicate handling: my personal safety. Once Douglas realized I knew about his activities, there was no predicting how he might react. Men who'd built criminal enterprises rarely surrendered quietly, especially when facing the prospect of prison time. "I want you to arrange for private security," I told Elsie. "Someone discreet, someone who can provide protection without Douglas. Knowing if he discovers what we're doing before Wednesday?" "Already handled," Elsie replied, showing me a business card. "I called them yesterday. They specialize in protecting executives during corporate investigations. They'll have someone watching the house starting Monday." Sunday evening, Douglas returned from his supposed golf tournament with stories about his terrible putting and complaints about the weather. He seemed relaxed, even affectionate, bringing me a bottle of wine from a vineyard he claimed to have visited. I accepted his gifts and listened to his stories, all while knowing that in 3 days, his world would collapse completely. The wine he'd given me probably came from the same store where he'd bought gifts for Diana. The golf tournament had likely been a weekend getaway with his girlfriend, funded by money stolen from development deals he'd orchestrated using my identity. "You seem different," Douglas observed as we sat in our living room, sipping the wine he'd brought home. "More relaxed. Have you been feeling better?" "Much better," I replied. And it was true. The rage and betrayal I'd felt initially had crystallized into something more powerful. Absolute certainty about what needed to be done. "Good," Douglas said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "I've been worried about you. You seemed stressed lately, distracted. I was wondering if maybe we should take a vacation, get away from work for a while." The irony was perfect. Douglas was suggesting we take a vacation just days before his arrest, using money he'd stolen to fund a romantic getaway while federal investigators closed in on his criminal enterprise. "That sounds wonderful," I agreed, knowing he'd be taking his vacation in a federal detention facility. Monday morning, Douglas left for work with his usual kiss and promises about an early dinner. I watched his car disappear down the street, then turned to begin the final phase of my preparation. In 48 hours, I would walk into the state attorney general's office and hand them everything they needed to destroy the man who'd tried to destroy me. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and Douglas had no idea the trap was already closing. Monday morning brought an unexpected opportunity. Douglas received a phone call at breakfast that made his face light up with excitement, though he tried to hide his reaction behind his coffee cup. "Really? Today?" he said into the phone, his voice carefully modulated. "I thought that wasn't scheduled until next week." A pause. No, that's perfect. I can rearrange my appointments." After hanging up, Douglas turned to me with an expression of manufactured disappointment. "Emergency client meeting. The Patterson project hit a snag with the city planning office, and they need me there this afternoon to sort it out." I nodded sympathetically, though I knew the Patterson project had been completed 2 months ago. "These things happen. Will you be home for dinner?" "Probably not," Douglas replied, already calculating in his head. "These city meetings can run very late. Don't wait up." Perfect. Whatever Douglas had planned for today, he'd just given me the entire afternoon and evening to observe his activities without having to maintain the pretense of being a trusting wife. After Douglas left, I called the private security firm Elsie had arranged. Within an hour, I was briefed on surveillance protocols and equipped with a GPS tracker that would allow me to monitor Douglas's movements in real time through a secure app on my phone. The tracker showed Douglas heading downtown, toward the government district, which initially seemed to support his story about city meetings. But instead of stopping at City Hall or the planning office, the GPS dot came to rest at the Four Seasons Hotel. I drove downtown and positioned myself in the lobby of the building across from the hotel, a vantage point that allowed me to monitor the main entrance while remaining unobserved. At 12:30 p.m., Douglas emerged from the hotel with Diana and walked toward the Wellington building, my building. But they weren't alone. Following about 20 feet behind were 2 men I didn't recognize, both wearing expensive suits and carrying briefcases. Their body language suggested they were either clients or very important business associates. I followed at a distance, using the knowledge of downtown traffic patterns that came from 20 years of doing business in the area. When they entered the Wellington building, I used my owner's access to monitor their movements through the security system. They didn't go to Pinnacle Properties offices on the 3rd floor. Instead, they took the elevator directly to the 10th floor, to my executive conference room, the same space where Douglas and Diana had been conducting their unauthorized meetings for months. But today's meeting was different. The security cameras showed Douglas and Diana setting up presentation materials, arranging documents on the conference table, and preparing what appeared to be a formal business presentation. When the two unknown men entered the room, the atmosphere was clearly that of a high-stakes negotiation. I enhanced the camera footage and managed to capture clear images of the documents spread on the table. Property maps, development plans, financial projections, but not just any properties. These were detailed plans for the warehouse district development project I'd been working on for 2 years, the project Douglas had helped sabotage. My hands trembled as I realized what I was witnessing. Douglas wasn't just meeting with clients. He was selling my stolen development plans to new investors, using my own conference room to negotiate deals that would profit from years of my work and planning. I called Scott immediately. "I need you to get down to the Wellington building right now," I said, my voice tight with controlled rage. 10th floor, executive conference room, and bring a court reporter if you can find one. "Margaret, what's happening?" "Douglas is selling my development plans to investors in my own building. I'm watching it happen live on security cameras." 20 minutes later, Scott arrived with a court reporter and a notary. Using my authority as building owner, I provided them with access to the conference room's adjacent storage area, where they could hear and document everything being discussed without being seen. The conversation they recorded was devastating. Douglas was presenting himself as the primary developer for the warehouse district project, offering exclusive development rights to properties he didn't own, using plans he'd stolen from me. Diana was providing marketing projections and investor analysis that painted the project as a guaranteed profit center. But the most damaging revelation came when one of the investors asked about regulatory approval timelines. Douglas assured them that permitting would be expedited through established relationships with city officials. And Diana added that all necessary arrangements with the Planning Commission have already been made. They were documenting their own corruption in real time, creating evidence of bribery and regulatory fraud that would be impossible to deny or explain away. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When it concluded, the investors had committed to a $50 million investment in a project they believed Douglas controlled, based on plans they thought he'd developed, with regulatory approvals they assumed he'd legitimately obtained. Every word of their conversation had been recorded and notarized. As the investors left the building, Douglas and Diana remained in the conference room for what appeared to be a celebration. They embraced, laughed, and shared what looked like an expensive bottle of champagne that had been waiting in the room. They thought they'd just secured their financial future. They had no idea they'd just documented the evidence that would send them to prison. That evening, I sat in my office reviewing the recordings Scott had obtained, adding them to the comprehensive file we would present to the state attorney general. In 2 days, Douglas had finally made the mistake that would destroy him completely. Tuesday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually energized me for important business decisions. Today, it would fuel the final preparations for Douglas's destruction. He left for work with his usual routine, mentioning a busy day of client meetings, completely unaware that each lie he told was being cataloged for tomorrow's presentation. To the State Attorney General. Elsie arrived at 8 a.m. with the final batch of financial records we'd requested through legitimate business channels. What she'd uncovered in the past 48 hours completed the picture of Douglas's criminal enterprise in ways that even I hadn't anticipated. "Margaret, you need to see this," she said, spreading bank statements across my conference table. "The Wellington Development Consortium isn't just using your name. They've been moving money through accounts that are linked to your Social Security number." I studied the documents, feeling my blood pressure rise with each page. Douglas hadn't just stolen my identity for business purposes. He'd opened financial accounts using my personal information, creating a paper trail that made me appear to be an active participant in money laundering operations. He's been depositing payments from the fraudulent development contracts into accounts that show me as the primary account holder, I said, tracing the money flow with my finger. If investigators follow this money trail without context, it looks like I'm the one receiving payments for corrupt deals. It gets worse, Elsie replied, pulling out another set of documents. I found tax filings for Wellington Development Consortium that show you as the majority stakeholder. Douglas filed these with the IRS 3 months ago, claiming you earned $2.3 million in development fees last year, money that went into accounts you never knew existed. The systematic nature of the frame job was breathtaking. Douglas hadn't just been stealing from me, he'd been positioning me as the criminal mastermind while he played the role of junior partner. When law enforcement eventually investigated, I would appear to be the primary beneficiary of the corruption scheme. But Douglas had made a crucial error. In his eagerness to use my reputation and credit rating to legitimize his operations, he'd created a paper trail that could be definitively proven false through the security footage and scheduling records I possessed. Every single one of these meetings where contracts were negotiated happened while I was provably somewhere else, I told Elsie, cross-referencing the dates with my appointment calendar. Board meetings, property inspections, legal depositions. I have witnesses and documentation proving I was never present for any of the criminal activities. We spent the morning creating what Scott called an innocence timeline, a comprehensive document that proved my absence from every meeting, every negotiation, and every transaction that Douglas had conducted using my identity. Security camera footage, appointment records, witness statements, and credit card transactions all confirmed that I had been systematically excluded from the criminal enterprise being run in my name. At noon, Scott arrived with additional evidence that the State Attorney General's office had agreed to share in advance of our meeting. What he showed me made the scope of Douglas's crimes clear in ways I hadn't imagined. The AG's investigation started with a tip about irregularities in municipal development permits, Scott explained, opening a thick folder. But what they've uncovered is a network of corruption that involves 14 different development projects, 6 city officials, and approximately $80 million in fraudulent contracts. The list of implicated officials included not just Simone Crawford and Marcus Webb, but the deputy mayor, 2 city council members, and the head of the Municipal Water Authority. Douglas and Diana had been operating at the highest levels of city government, facilitating meetings and negotiations that had corrupted nearly every aspect of the development approval process. "Where does this leave Douglas?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "He's going to be the primary target," Scott replied. "The financial evidence shows that almost all of the illegal payments flowed through accounts connected to him, and the communications they've intercepted suggest he was coordinating the entire operation. But there was one more revelation that changed everything. The state investigation had been triggered by a whistleblower, someone inside the network who had begun providing evidence to prosecutors months ago. "Who?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. Scott consulted his notes. The initial tip came from someone identified only as Source M in the court documents. Based on the information they provided, it appears to be someone with intimate knowledge of the financial operations and access to internal communications. My mind raced through the possibilities. Someone inside Douglas's network had been feeding information to prosecutors, someone who knew enough about the operation to provide specific details about money transfers and meeting schedules. "Scott," I said slowly, "I think Douglas's network is eating itself from the inside. Someone got scared about the scope of the crimes and decided to protect themselves by cooperating with prosecutors." That evening, Douglas returned home with stories about a successful day of client meetings and news about potential new projects. He seemed relaxed, even optimistic, completely unaware that his criminal network was collapsing around him. "You seem happy," I observed as we sat down to dinner. "Things are really coming together," Douglas replied, cutting into his steak with satisfaction. "All the hard work of the past 2 years is finally paying off." 24 hours from now, he would discover exactly how those 2 years of hard work would pay off, with federal indictments and prison sentences. But tonight, I would let him enjoy his last dinner as a free man. Tomorrow, everything would change. Wednesday morning arrived with the weight of finality. In 4 hours, I would walk into the State Attorney General's office and hand them everything they needed to destroy Douglas completely. But first, I had one crucial meeting that would determine exactly how devastating the consequences would be. At 9 a.m., I sat across from federal prosecutor Amanda Chen in her downtown office, a woman whose reputation for dismantling white-collar criminal enterprises was legendary. Scott had arranged this meeting through carefully cultivated contacts, understanding that state-level charges would only be the beginning of Douglas's legal troubles. "Mrs. Wellington," Amanda began, reviewing the thick folder of evidence I'd provided, "what you've documented here goes far beyond municipal corruption. We're looking at federal crimes, wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and potentially RICO violations if we can prove the organized nature of the enterprise." She flipped through the financial records, studying the complex web of shell companies and fraudulent accounts. "The sophistication of this operation suggests your husband had significant help setting up these financial structures. Do you have any knowledge of who might have provided that expertise?" "I believe Diana Carmichael coordinated much of the financial architecture," I replied. "Her background includes a finance degree from Boston University, and she had access to the banking relationships necessary to establish these accounts." Amanda made notes, her expression growing more serious as she reviewed the security footage. "From my building. This video evidence is extraordinary. We have documented proof of city officials receiving payments, developers coordinating bids, and your husband orchestrating meetings that resulted in specific contract awards." But what interested Amanda most was the scope of the identity theft. "The systematic use of your personal information to establish financial accounts and business entities represents one of the most comprehensive cases of spousal identity fraud we've encountered. Your husband essentially created a parallel version of your business identity." "What does that mean for the charges he'll face?" I asked. "Multiple federal felonies, each carrying potential sentences of 10-20 years, Amanda replied without hesitation. "The money laundering charges alone could result in life imprisonment given the amounts involved. When we add the identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges, your husband is looking at spending the rest of his life in federal prison." She closed the folder and looked at me directly. "Mrs. Wellington, I want you to understand that by cooperating with this investigation, you're not just helping us prosecute your husband. You're helping us dismantle a criminal network that has corrupted municipal government and defrauded taxpayers of millions of dollars." "I understand," I replied. "And I want to be clear. I will provide any additional evidence or testimony necessary to ensure that everyone involved faces appropriate consequences." Amanda smiled for the first time during our meeting. "We'll be coordinating with the State Attorney General's office to ensure there's no overlap in charges. By this time next week, federal marshals will be executing arrest warrants for your husband and his associates." As I left Amanda's office, I felt the weight of 18 months of betrayal finally lifting from my shoulders. Douglas had built his criminal empire using my name, my reputation, and my resources. In 7 days, he would discover the price of underestimating Margaret Wellington. The trap was set, and tomorrow it would spring closed. Thursday morning, my phone rang at 6:47 a.m. with a call that would change everything I thought I knew about Douglas's betrayal. The caller ID showed Scott's number, but his voice carried an urgency I'd never heard before. "Margaret, we have a problem," he said without preamble. The state investigation hit a major snag yesterday evening. Someone leaked information about today's arrests, and key evidence has disappeared. I sat up in bed, my mind immediately racing through implications. What kind of evidence? Financial records from 3 major banks, computer servers from 2 of the shell companies, and, most critically, security footage from several municipal buildings where the corrupt meetings took place. My blood ran cold. How is that possible? Professional. Level document destruction, Scott replied grimly. This wasn't some panicked attempt to hide evidence. This was systematic, coordinated, and executed with the kind of expertise that suggests law enforcement involvement. Douglas was still asleep beside me, his breathing deep and regular. But as Scott continued speaking, I noticed something that made my heart pound. Douglas's phone, usually charging on his nightstand, was missing. "Scott, I need to call you back," I whispered, slipping out of bed as quietly as possible. In my home office, I accessed the Wellington Building's security system to review the overnight footage. What I saw made my hands shake as I scrolled through the timestamps. At 2:15 a.m., someone had entered the building using Diana's access card. But it wasn't Diana. The figure on camera was larger, moving with the confident stride of someone familiar with the building's layout. Someone who knew exactly where the security servers were located. The footage showed this person accessing the building's main computer room, where all security data was stored. They worked for exactly 47 minutes before leaving with several hard drives containing months of recorded meetings, conversations, and evidence of corruption that could have sent dozens of people to prison. But the most shocking revelation came when I enhanced the image quality. The person who had stolen my security footage, who had destroyed evidence that could have sent Douglas to prison for life, was someone I recognized immediately. Darrell Hammond, the CEO of Metropolitan Development Group, the man I'd seen in meetings. With Douglas and Diana, the man I'd assumed was simply another corrupt client in their network. Darrell wasn't just a client. He was running the operation. I called Amanda Chen immediately, not caring about the early hour. "Amanda, we have a serious problem," I said when she answered. The evidence theft wasn't random. It was coordinated by someone with inside knowledge of both the investigation and my security systems. I explained what I'd discovered, sending her the enhanced security footage while we spoke. Her silence stretched for nearly a minute before she responded. "Mrs. Wellington, this changes everything. If Darrell Hammond has been orchestrating this operation, we're not dealing with municipal corruption. We're dealing with organized crime that reaches into multiple state governments." As Amanda spoke, I pulled up everything I could find about Hammond online. What I discovered painted a picture that was far more sophisticated and dangerous than anything I'd imagined. Hammond wasn't just a successful developer. He was connected to political figures at the state and federal level, served on multiple municipal planning boards, and had been involved in development projects across 6 states. What does that mean? For Douglas, I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. "It means your husband isn't the mastermind we thought he was," Amanda replied. "He's a mid-level operator in something much larger and much more dangerous." The implications were staggering. Douglas hadn't been running a local corruption scheme. He'd been recruited into a network that operated across state lines, involving federal contracts and interstate commerce. The charges he would face weren't just state-level corruption, but federal racketeering, conspiracy, and potentially violations of the RICO Act. But there was something else that made my stomach clench with fear. If Hammond was sophisticated enough to coordinate evidence destruction across multiple jurisdictions, and if he had the resources to penetrate law enforcement investigations, then everyone who could testify against him was in potential danger. "Amanda," I said carefully, "if Hammond knows about the investigation, does he know about my cooperation with your office?" Another long pause. "We have to assume he does. Mrs. Wellington, I'm going to recommend that you accept federal protection until we can execute the arrests. How long will that take?" "With the evidence destruction, we'll need to rebuild parts of our case. Maybe 2 weeks, possibly longer. 2 weeks of living in hiding while Douglas continued to sleep beside me, unaware that both of us were now targets of a criminal organization that had already demonstrated its willingness to obstruct justice through sophisticated means. I looked toward my bedroom, where Douglas still slept peacefully, completely unaware that the criminal empire he thought he controlled was actually controlling him, and that his wife had just become a target for elimination by people who viewed murder as simply another business expense. The game had changed again, and the stakes were now higher than I'd ever imagined. This wasn't just about justice or revenge anymore. This was about survival. As I ended the call with Amanda, I realized that in trying to destroy Douglas's criminal network, I'd uncovered something that could destroy us both. Hammond's organization had resources, connections, and a demonstrated willingness to use violence to protect their interests. Douglas had thought he was playing a game he could win through deception and betrayal. Neither of us had realized he'd challenged people who played for keeps and who eliminated threats rather than simply outmaneuvering them. The woman who had built a real estate empire through careful planning and calculated risks was now facing opponents who operated by entirely different rules where the penalty for losing wasn't just financial ruin or professional disgrace. It was death. Noon Thursday, the full scope of Daryl Hammond's operation had become devastatingly clear. Amanda Chen's federal task force had been tracking Hammond's network across 4 states, but they'd never had the kind of inside access that my security footage provided. Hammond's organization is sophisticated beyond anything we've seen in municipal corruption, Amanda explained during our emergency meeting. He identifies mid-level professionals like your husband, architects, engineers, marketing coordinators, and builds them into local networks that can influence development decisions. The pattern was brilliant in its simplicity. Hammond would find ambitious professionals in positions that touched the development process, then create opportunities for them to profit from insider information. Douglas and Diana weren't unique. They were part of a franchise operation that Hammond had replicated in cities across the Northeast. But here's what Hammond didn't anticipate, Amanda continued, spreading surveillance photos across her desk. Your husband got sloppy because he thought he was dealing with a local operation. He documented everything, used unsecured communications, and most importantly, he conducted business in a building where every activity was recorded. The irony was perfect. Douglas's arrogance had created the evidence trail that would bring down not just his local network, but Hammond's entire multi-state operation. What do you need from me? I asked. Continue acting normally until we execute the arrests, Amanda replied. We're coordinating with task forces in New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island to take down Hammond's entire network simultaneously. That's happening Monday morning. But Amanda had one more piece of information that made everything fall into place. We've identified the whistleblower who triggered the original investigation. It was Diana Carmichael. My head snapped up. Diana? But she's part of the operation. She was, Amanda corrected. But 6 months ago, Hammond pressured her to recruit her younger sister into the network. Diana's sister is a junior planner in Hartford's development office. When Diana realized Hammond wanted to corrupt her family member, she contacted our office through an anonymous tip line. The revelation recontextualized everything I'd observed. Diana's relationship with Douglas hadn't just been personal, it had been part of her cooperation with federal investigators. She'd been documenting the network from the inside while maintaining her cover. The meetings in your building that we thought were planning sessions were actually Diana collecting evidence, Amanda continued. She's been wearing recording devices for months, capturing conversations that detail the entire scope of Hammond's operation. I thought about all the footage I'd gathered, all the anger I'd felt watching Diana with my husband. She'd been playing a role, maintaining cover in an investigation that would ultimately destroy the man she appeared to be sleeping with. Where does this leave Douglas? I asked, facing serious federal charges, but with the possibility of cooperation. If he provides testimony against Hammond, Amanda replied. Diana's recordings prove your husband was following orders rather than making strategic decisions. As I drove home that afternoon, I realized that everything I thought I knew about Douglas's betrayal had been reframed. He was still guilty of adultery, of using my identity, of violating my trust. But he was also in far more danger than I'd realized. Monday morning, when federal agents arrested Daryl Hammond, Douglas would discover that the criminal empire he thought he controlled had actually been using him. The question was whether I would warn him or let him face the consequences of his choices alone. Friday evening, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. As Douglas sat in our living room, reviewing what he believed were legitimate architectural plans, I walked upstairs to my office and began the final phase of my preparation. Diana Carmichael might have been working undercover for federal investigators, but that didn't change the fundamental violation of my marriage, my home, and my business. Douglas had still given another woman keys to our house, still used my identity to commit fraud, still betrayed 17 years of marriage for what he thought was easy money. The federal investigation would handle Hammond's criminal network. But Douglas's personal betrayal of me required a different kind of justice. I opened my laptop and began assembling a comprehensive dossier that would ensure Douglas understood the full scope of what he'd lost through his choices. This wasn't about criminal charges. This was about the complete dismantling of the life he'd taken for granted. First, I documented every property where Douglas's name appeared on ownership documents. Over the years, I'd added him to several deeds for estate planning purposes, a decision I now regretted but could easily remedy. The legal paperwork to remove his name from all properties was already prepared, waiting only for my signature. Second, I gathered evidence of every lie Douglas had told me over the past 18 months. Not just the obvious ones about working late or client meetings, but the subtle deceptions that had undermined our entire relationship. His fake concern about my stress levels while he was causing them, his suggestions for romantic dinners while he was planning dates with Diana, his talk about our future while he was systematically destroying it. Third, I compiled financial records showing exactly how much Douglas's participation in Hammond's network had cost our family. The money he'd spent on Diana, the business opportunities I'd lost due to his sabotage of my development projects, the legal fees that would be required to untangle his crimes from my legitimate business interests. The total came to $2.7 million in direct losses and missed opportunities. But the most devastating document I prepared was a timeline showing Douglas's choices at every critical moment. When Hammond's network had first approached him, Douglas could have reported it to authorities. When Diana had asked for building access, Douglas could have refused. When he'd been asked to use my identity for fraudulent contracts, Douglas could have said no. Instead, at every decision point, Douglas had chosen personal profit over family loyalty, easy money over ethical behavior, criminal conspiracy over honest work. At 11 p.m., I printed everything and placed it in a manila envelope labeled, "For Douglas." Tomorrow morning, after federal agents arrested Hammond and his network, I would hand Douglas this envelope and explain that while the government would handle his criminal prosecution, I would handle the personal consequences of his betrayal. 17. Years of marriage ended not by a moment of weakness or a single bad decision, but by 18 months of systematic choices that had prioritized criminal profit over family loyalty. Douglas had been sleeping soundly beside me each night, unaware that every lie he told was being documented, every betrayal cataloged, every choice recorded for the final accounting that was coming. Monday morning would bring federal agents and criminal charges, but Sunday night would bring something Douglas feared more than prison: the complete loss of everything he'd taken for granted. The woman he'd underestimated was about to show him exactly what that mistake would cost. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made decisive action feel inevitable. Douglas left early for what he claimed was a site inspection, kissing my cheek with the casual affection of a man who believed his secrets were safe. I watched his BMW disappear down our street, knowing it would be one of the last times he'd drive away from our home as my husband. The house felt different once he was gone. Not empty, but expectant, as if the walls themselves were preparing for the transformation that was coming. I walked through each room methodically, seeing everything with new eyes, deciding what belonged to the life I was building and what belonged to the marriage I was ending. In our bedroom, I opened Douglas's side of the walk-in closet and began the careful process of packing his belongings. Each item told a story of deception. The expensive suits he'd claimed were necessary for client meetings while using them to impress Diana. The cologne I'd given him for Christmas that had become his signature scent for another woman. The cufflinks from our anniversary that had been worn to celebrate business deals that defrauded me. But I didn't pack with anger. Instead, I folded each shirt with the same precision I'd used for property contracts, arranged each tie with the attention to detail that had built my real estate empire. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was the systematic conclusion of a business relationship that had been terminated due to breach of contract. In the master suitcase, the leather set we'd bought for our honeymoon in Tuscany, I placed a USB drive containing copies of every piece of evidence I'd gathered. Security footage of his meetings with Diana, financial records showing his use of my identity, documentation of every lie he'd told and every choice he'd made that had led to this moment. Alongside the digital evidence, I included printed photographs, Douglas and Diana in my executive conference room, their intimate moments captured in the space where I conducted million-dollar negotiations, Douglas accepting keys from Diana in the parking garage of my building, Douglas meeting with Hammond and corrupt city officials in facilities I owned and paid for. Each photograph was dated and time-stamped, creating a visual timeline of betrayal that would be impossible to deny or explain away. In a separate envelope, I placed documents that would reshape Douglas's immediate future: divorce papers citing adultery and fraud, legal notices removing his name from all property deeds, a restraining order preventing him from accessing any of my business facilities, and a formal complaint to the State Architectural Licensing Board detailing his use of professional relationships for criminal purposes. The final item I packed was a single sheet of paper with Monday's date and a simple message: "Your new address will be provided by federal marshals." By Sunday evening, 4 suitcases and 3 boxes sat by our front door like sentinels guarding the threshold between Douglas's old life and his new reality. Everything he owned, everything he'd built his identity around, reduced to luggage waiting for departure. I sat in our living room, my living room now, sipping wine and reviewing the life I was reclaiming. Tomorrow would bring chaos, arrests, and headlines. But tonight, in the stillness before the storm, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 18 months: complete peace with my decisions. Douglas had systematically destroyed our marriage for criminal profit. Now he would discover the price of underestimating the woman who'd built an empire while he was building lies. Douglas's key turned in the lock at exactly 6:15 p.m. Sunday evening, the same punctual timing that had once been a comfort and was now just another predictable element of his elaborate deception. I sat in the living room, dressed in the navy blue suit I wore for the most important negotiations, my posture straight and my expression calm. "Margaret?" he called out, his voice echoing through the foyer. "Why are all these—" His words died as he appeared in the doorway, his eyes moving from my face to his packed luggage arranged by the entrance. "Welcome home," I said, my voice carrying the same professional tone I used for difficult property closings. "Your belongings are ready for transport." Douglas dropped his keys, the metal clinking against the hardwood floor with finality. "What is this? Are you leaving me?" "No, Douglas," I replied, standing and straightening my jacket. "You're leaving, immediately." I handed him a manila folder containing carefully selected evidence, enough to make my point crystal clear, but not everything I possessed. Open it." His hands trembled as he flipped through the photographs. Himself with Diana in my conference room, meetings with Hammond and corrupt officials, financial documents showing his systematic use of my identity. I watched the color drain from his face as the scope of his exposed crimes became undeniable. "How did you—" he started, then stopped, his mind clearly racing through the implications. "I've known for months," I said matter-of-factly. "About Diana. About Hammond. About every fraudulent contract you've signed using my name. I know about the money laundering, the bribes, the corruption network you thought you were clever enough to hide." Douglas stepped toward me, his expression shifting to the desperate charm he'd probably used with Diana. "Margaret, you don't understand. I can explain everything. This isn't what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," I interrupted. "You committed adultery, fraud, and identity theft. You used my reputation to legitimize criminal activities and my properties to facilitate corruption. You systematically destroyed everything we built together for short-term criminal profit." His phone rang, the sharp sound cutting through the tension. Douglas glanced at the screen, and I saw his face go white. "Unknown number," he whispered. "Answer it," I commanded. Douglas's voice was barely audible as he accepted the call. I could hear a woman's voice on the other end, professional and crisp. "Mr. Wellington, this is Special Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI. We need you to come to our field office immediately for questioning regarding your involvement in the Hammond investigation." The phone slipped from Douglas's fingers, clattering to the floor. "Tomorrow morning," I continued as if the call hadn't interrupted us. "Federal agents will execute arrests throughout Hammond's network. You have two choices. You can cooperate with investigators and potentially receive reduced charges, or you can maintain your loyalty to people who used you as expendable talent." Douglas sank into the nearest chair, his face buried in his hands. "Margaret, please, we can work this out. I'll fix everything." "There is no we anymore," I replied, picking up my purse and walking toward the door. "Your taxi arrives in 20 minutes. Your attorney's number is in the folder." As I reached the doorway, I turned back one final time. "Douglas, you had everything. A successful wife, a beautiful home, a legitimate business reputation. You traded it all for a criminal enterprise that never valued you as anything more than a useful fool." The door closed behind me with quiet finality, leaving Douglas alone with his packed belongings and the consequences of 18 months of catastrophic choices. 6 months later, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new corner office, in the renovated Wellington Tower, watching the morning sun illuminate the city I'd helped reshape. The building that had once housed Douglas's criminal meetings was now the headquarters of Wellington Properties' expanded operations, transformed from a site of betrayal into a symbol of renewal. The morning newspaper lay open on my desk, its headline reading, "Hammond Network Sentences Finalized." Douglas had received 8 years in federal prison after cooperating with prosecutors, a sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and the value of his testimony in dismantling Hammond's multi-state operation. Diana Carmichael had been released after 6 months of federal protection, her undercover work having provided the evidence that convicted 12 officials and 14 business conspirators. Darrell Hammond himself had been sentenced to 25 years without possibility of parole, but the criminal justice system's resolution was only part of the story. The real transformation had been personal, professional, and profound. Within weeks of Douglas's arrest, I'd expanded Wellington Properties into the commercial development sector, using the warehouse district plans I'd originally created to build what was now being called the city's most innovative mixed-use development. The project that Douglas had tried to steal and sell had become the foundation for my company's next phase of growth. The divorce had been finalized 4 months ago, with Douglas signing away all claims to assets in exchange for my agreement not to pursue additional civil litigation. He'd left the marriage with nothing but legal debt and federal supervision. I'd retained everything we'd built together, plus the knowledge that I'd never again confuse love with trust or partnership with dependence. My phone buzzed with a text from Elsie. The Hartford project contracts are ready for your signature. The team is waiting in conference room A. Hartford, the next city where I decided to expand, partly because it was where Diana's sister worked in the planning office, the young woman whose safety had motivated Diana to become an FBI informant. I'd hired Diana as a consultant on the Hartford project, recognizing that her experience navigating corruption had given her unique insights into legitimate development processes. It had been a controversial decision that some of my board members had questioned, but I'd learned to trust my judgment about people's capacity for redemption when their motivations were fundamentally sound. As I walked toward the conference room, I passed the memorial wall I'd installed in the building's lobby. Not a memorial to the dead, but to the businesses and careers destroyed by Hammond's network. 43 legitimate companies had been damaged by the corruption scheme, their owners and employees suffering consequences for crimes they'd never committed. Their stories reminded me daily that justice was about more than personal vindication. It was about rebuilding trust in systems that ethical people depended on. The conference room doors opened to reveal my team of 12 professionals, each of them chosen not just for their expertise, but for their integrity. No more partnerships based on convenience or assumed loyalty. Every relationship, professional and personal, would be built on demonstrated character and mutual respect. "Good morning," I said, taking my seat at the head of the table. "Let's build something honest." Outside the windows, the city sprawled. Beneath us, full of opportunities for those willing to work for them legitimately. I'd learned that power built on deception was always temporary, but power built on competence and integrity could last forever. Douglas had taught me that lesson, though not in the way he'd intended. Now it was time to use it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.